If you want to write scary stories and make it not completely suck, avoid these writing mistakes. Stephen King never makes these mistakes when writing horror, and neither should you. Now, I wouldn't say I'm the best horror writer, but I have years of experience writing short horror stories, so let's jump right in. Mistake number 1, being too corny. Now, this might sound weird, but bear with me. I've reviewed a lot of short horror stories for clients, and one of the biggest issues I've found is that these stories just can't be taken seriously. Now, I'm not saying they were bad stories. With some improvements, a lot of these stories could have been just as good as any story you'd read by a published author. The one place these stories fell short, though, was the fact that there were elements that just couldn't be taken seriously. In one story I reviewed, the main character meets up with another character, has a very short conversation, and the two simply decide to work together with a, yeah, maybe, but we stick together, no funny business. That's an actual quote from the story. And then more or less they just become best of friends. Now this isn't the best example, but there are other things you can look out for. Make your characters believable. Don't turn your horror story into a fanfic either by name-dropping some famous characters you're a fan of, or other horror stories. You want immersion, and being too corny ruins this. Other examples could include cliched dialogue, or villains who seem too cartoony. It might seem obvious, but you want your own story to give you chills. Now turn out the lights, put some creepy music on, and really get immersed. Are you scared of your story, or are you just cringing? Mistake number 2, overloading on fear. Yes, you're writing a horror story. That doesn't mean that every second needs to introduce some new jump scare or some new horrific event. What's the most afraid you've ever been in real life? Think about it for a second. Maybe it was jump scare after jump scare, but that's highly unlikely. For me at least, I become the most afraid when there's a very real possibility of something horrible happening, and then I just have to stew in it. Maybe I have to wait for seconds, hours, or days, but I'm just sitting there waiting for that inevitable horrible thing to take place. Okay, so maybe I just have anxiety issues, but I still think this is a good tip. Too many people overload their stories, and then it ends up just numbing the reader to anything actually scary. Mistake number 3, switching tenses. This one should be pretty self-explanatory, but it's one of the biggest issues with bad horror stories that I read. If you want to write a horror story, or really anything, don't swap tenses every 30 seconds. If you're going from, I walked along the cold, dark street, to, he walks along the cold, dark street, then your reader is going to have no idea what is going on. Seriously, please don't do this one. It's one of my biggest pet peeves. Mistake number 4, too much dialogue. So many stories I read have a focus on dialogue. Now that can be good for certain types of books, where characters take the forefront and interactions are key to progressing the story. Usually, however, I've found that horror stories don't need as much dialogue as a lot of people add. Dialogue can actually take away from a story and make it sound far worse unless it's done right. And even if your dialogue is great, adding too much can be a deal breaker. Instead, focus on building up your stories with character actions, thoughts, feelings, and the environment. This works way better and makes your story more immersive for the reader. I want to keep it short and sweet, so that's it for this video. If you want to see more content, please consider subscribing. It helps out my channel a bunch. If you really like my content and want to support me, you can become a channel member or check out my novel.